Sector Report is proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.
Welcome to Tower Sector Report. I'm David Beatson, and this week we're on the move with rural contractors, pastoral farmers and farm prices. It looks like rural contractors have a breakthrough in their battle for road rule changes. We check out how dairy, sheep and venison farmers have been improving their performance over the last year, and we explore whether the recent rise in farm sales is good news or bad news, or a bit of both. Last week we told you about the rural contractors' long-running campaign for more flexibility in the rules of the road, and that it looked like they'd just achieved a breakthrough. The government has instructed the Ministry of Transport to start working on a review of transport rules affecting agricultural contractors and their vehicles. The officials will be looking at overseas models, producing a position paper for stakeholders later this year, and reporting back to the government next year after the election. Our Rural Affairs correspondent Drew Chappell has been checking to see how much progress is likely to be made.
Farmers are typically a fairly quiet bunch, minding their own substantial businesses and getting on with things. When they're fired up though, they can certainly make some serious noise. One issue that's had many hot under the swan-dry collar recently is that of transport law, the regulations governing farming contractors and the use of equipment and staff around busy times of the year. The Rural Contractors Association, along with federated farmers and others in the industry, have been calling for a fairer system, which recognises the unique challenges of harvest time, spraying seasons, and large, complex machinery. 2004's Rural Contractor of the Year, Bill Webb, had to chuck in the towel earlier this year due to problems with the rules, specifically around work time restrictions and weight permits. He says even the government's vehicle investigation arm, the CVIU, doesn't always understand the rules either.
I think they struggle to understand the rules as well. They do their best to interpret the law. Because it can be interpreted so many different ways, you ask 2 or 3 different people about something and you'll probably get 3 different answers. So it is a very tricky one to deal with.
The government has heard these concerns and obviously been listening. Associate Transport Minister Nathan Guy announcing a full review of all transport regulations around agricultural contracting in September.
I don't think we can ever get to a point where we don't have any rules, because the pressure's on, right? When the sun is shining, the hay needs to be made, silage, crops need to be harvested or planted. There's a whole variety of different scenarios. So we know that there is a window of opportunity with the weather. We realise that these guys need to work hard when that weather is on their side. But the reality is we need to balance up that with ensuring that we do have some rules, that they work in an appropriate fashion, that they aren't, I guess, being too restrictive on the industry, and we need to, as I mentioned before, we need to ensure that these operators, when they get on the road, are operating in a safe environment.
Agriculture Minister David Carter is another national MP and farm owner and says the current government has taken criticism of the current rules on board.
As I've talked to the rural contractors around the country, they have been concerned about some of the rules that are imposed by the Ministry of Transport. I've worked very closely with my ministerial colleague Nathan Guy. We're keen to look at any rule that we see as an impediment to doing business. And in the agricultural sector, at the time you need to harvest, you often need to harvest very, very quickly. Having said that, safety is paramount. So it is a matter of reviewing it in such a way that we address safety issues and yet try and assist the agricultural contractors to get the work done when it's required to be done.
David Carter says years on the farm have shown him it's an industry unlike any other and needs its own set of rules.
I've been one of those guys who, before I came into Parliament, when the hay had to be baled, we were there doing it, and there were some long hours, and that is the nature of farming. When the weather's with you, you've got a crop that needs harvesting, it's absolutely critical that that job get done.
Ministry of Transport officials will consult with industry groups, federated farmers, rural contractors and other road users throughout the review process, as well as examining how international regulatory models compare to those in New Zealand. The time frame to see any actual law changes, however, will most likely be a lengthy one, if the review recommends a significant overhaul of the current system.
Well, who knows whether it's a regulation which is easier to do than legislation. If it's full-blown legislation, it's got to go through the parliamentary process, and that means first reading off to the select committee, submissions coming in from members of the public. So that process can take a year and a half. Regulations are a bit quicker. So we need to wait and see what the review comes up with.
Roger Parton is the chairman of the Agricultural Transport Forum and says the announcement was music to his ears, albeit a little overdue.
It's been a long time coming, but I think that hopefully we will be able to resolve it, and so instead of fixing one problem and creating another one somewhere else, we can actually get on and resolve all of the issues and carry on with life. Basically, we want to have rules that are easy to understand, easy to follow and easy to enforce for those who break them. But there's a whole number of things: over-dimensioned vehicles, overweight, because a lot of the agricultural vehicles don't fit within the norm, and the one size does not fit all. And what we need to do is to have rules which we can work within, remembering that most of the time the vehicles that we're talking about are not actually on the road, they're off the road. But when they go on the road, we want to make sure that they're safe for the user of the vehicle and for the public at large.
New Federated Farmers President Bruce Wills agrees and says it is possible to reach a compromise between safety and economic considerations.
This has been a problem area for some time. I guess when you get specialist heavy machinery that spends most of its life off-road, and then the small time it does spend on the road, these things aren't built for roads necessarily. So what's frustrated us is that we certainly get a lot of feedback, and we get, I think what we've seen over recent years is a whole lot of piecemeal rules and regulations put in place, and it's just not right. It's what we would call messy. So I think the review that Nathan Guy's called for is well welcomed by us, and we look forward to a comprehensive look at just getting some sensible, pragmatic, workable rules around these big machines on our country's roads.
Industry representatives will be hoping for a new system which reflects the difficult nature of agricultural work, which often means heavy machines travelling on public roads. Part of the problem is that since 2007, agricultural contractors have been held to the same laws as long-haul trucking companies, something industry insiders say is like putting a square peg in a round hole.
It's different for a long-haul operator who's got a truck in Auckland and he's got a load of freight to go to Wellington. He knows how far it is, and he can give designated breaks and stops along the way to give his driver the required break times. He knows when he gets to Wellington it's 12 hours maybe, gives his driver the rest of the day off, and then in the morning he collects the truck and brings it back to Auckland again. It's a known. It doesn't matter, revolve around the weather or anything. It's on tar seal, nothing changes. But in our situation, everything changes on an hourly basis.
While it's unlikely New Zealand will end up with a system similar to the US or Europe, where agricultural vehicles are largely exempt from transport regulations, the review may well make life easier for contractors under the pump. Bill Webb says it will take a big change, though, to get him back in the contracting game.
Well, it'd have to be lightened up considerably to where they are now. Overweight permits and things like that, there's not enough money in the industry. It's hard enough industry to be in now as it is because of all the competition, the weather, the compliance costs, machinery, depreciation, all that sort of thing, return on investment. It's very marginal, very slim margins. People think we're charging a lot, but we're barely covering costs.
Drew Chappell reporting. Coming up, there's been a significant improvement in pastoral farm profits in the last year. But where can the sector go from here? That's next on Tower Sector Report. Welcome back to Tower Sector Report. The latest MAF Farm Monitoring Report says the pastoral sector saw a significant improvement in profits in the year ended last June. Was that good news for the banks or good news for the country? What have our dairy, sheep and venison farmers been doing with those improved profits? To help us tackle those questions, we're being joined by MAF's Manager of North Island Region, Phil Journeau. Well, Phil, what are they doing with their money?
Well, a variety of things, David. Certainly in the dairying area, debt repayment is a significant issue. For sheep and beef farmers, it's more sort of a catch-up on deferred maintenance, fertiliser, that sort of thing. And similar with the deer farmers, you know, catching up on R&M.
Okay, let's look at the individual sector's performance. Dairy, what's been happening in dairy?
Well, the season just passed was not a great year climatically.
It wasn't a great year climatically, okay, but it seemed to be a pretty good year financially.
Financially, it was a great year, you know, record payout from Fonterra, and its overall dairy profitability was very good.
Mm-hmm. Sheep?
Well, a happy coincidence, you had very good lamb prices, wool came up. Spectacularly in a sense, and good beef prices. So they've had one of their best years probably for at least a decade.
Has that sort of seen any change in the balance? I mean, are they farming for meat? Are they farming for wool?
Oh, there's been quite a shift in over the last 5-10 years, more towards meat production versus wool. Mm-hmm. And that's just a relative profitability thing. You know, lamb's worth a lot more than wool.
But in the last year, we've seen a bit of a firming of wool prices. Wool price prospects look pretty good.
Yes.
I wondered if that had been reflected in the farm management practice.
Not at this stage.
Not that you could see in the year in question.
No. I mean, certainly with the improvement in wool, well, farmers are very pleased with it, but it'll take a few years of good wool prices before they sort of switch back, if you like. I
may be slaughtered for saying this by one of my friends who's a venison farmer, but what's been happening in terms of the venison sector?
Again, they had a very good year. Venison prices quite stable. You know, the schedule averaging around, I think, $7.50, which is very good. Historically, deer farmers had quite a tough time over the last decade. So the last couple of years has been very good for them.
One of the things I noted in terms of all of the sectors really that I saw the breakdowns for, and that is that farm working expenses are rising as well as profitability. What's driving that?
Well, expenses obviously related to income. The higher their income, the more farmers spend. But one of the
looked a little bit out of proportion actually.
Well,
when I looked at your graph.
Yeah. One of the big issues, I guess, with New Zealand farming over the last, at least the last decade, is that on-farm inflation has been well ahead of you know, the CPI, the normal sort of indicator of inflation.
Now, why is that? Because I would have thought that to a degree some of the farm inputs would be imported. And of course, we've had the value of the New Zealand dollar working in reverse when it comes to importing.
Yes.
Not so good for exporting, but quite good for importing.
Well, some of the drivers, certainly, was it a couple of years ago, fertiliser prices jumped significantly, which was a supply factor, if you like. But the underlying thing driving on-farm inflation is really coming from the domestic economy, central local government charges, for example.
Central government, local, oh, okay.
If you like, the non-competitive part of the economy, yes.
What are farmers doing as a result of this significant lift in their profitability? And we've seen it now over 2 to 3 years. So I would think it's beginning to show up in terms of their activities. So what have you seen?
Well, a bit of variation between the sectors. Dairying, in a general sense, has been more profitable on average. There's a significant debt problem in the dairy industry, so farmers are certainly looking to repay debt.
The banks are really looking for it too, because they're under tougher rules as well.
Yes.
They're not able to lend as much as they were on a property. Mm.
But still, I mean, there's on-farm development, improvements in dairy sheds, that sort of thing. Whereas with particularly sheep and beef farmers who've had a very tough decade, it's more around catching up on deferred fertiliser, repairs and maintenance, that sort of thing, just building the productive capacity of the farm back up.
The sheep and beef farmers have got their profits to the highest level in 10 years, according to this latest survey result. Have we actually seen the peak of their cycle?
Well, hard to say, David. Hopefully not. The short-term outlook looks good. I mean, we're excuse me.
But it is sort of cyclical, isn't it?
Yes.
And 10 years would seem to be a reasonable upward cycle.
Agreed, but in the short term, at least, we're reasonably confident that returns will stay up and profitability be quite good. MAF
says that again, sheep and beef farmers were conservative about spending because they feel there's been no substantial change to industry structures or strategies. Is that likely to hold their production back again in the coming seasons?
Well, not so much their production. I mean, we're expecting a much better lamb crop this year, which is more affected by the bad storms last year than anything. What it does do is make the farmers uncertain around their spending, and generally they're quite conservative because they can see there's still issues in the industry.
Okay, there are some new factors that are coming into play in this new year. Irrigation Acceleration Fund and the Primary Growth Partnership Fund. What kind of impact are they likely to have on production and performance going forward?
Well, all things being equal, they're likely to lift production. It's probably a longer term gain. We're not going to see anything in the first year or two. In terms of irrigation, there's sort of vast potential out there to irrigate a lot more land, which will have obvious implications for increases in production. The PGP projects around well, improving productivity, improving our marketing, that sort of thing. Again, it's probably a bit of a longer game. So give us 5 years, if you like.
One of the things about both those schemes, of course, is that they require a matching farmer investment. Are they willing to make the investment?
Well, to date, certainly with PGP, we're seeing industry and companies certainly stepping up to the plate. And off the top of my head, I think so far we've got, I think it's about 450 million pledged, if you like, in terms of projects over the next 5 to 7 years.
Well, that's a very positive result.
Absolutely.
Phil Jeannot, thank you very much.
Thank you, David.
Phil Jeannot, Maths Manager of North Island Regions. Next, the rising trend in farm sales. Is it good news for some, but maybe bad for others? We find out who and why. Next on Tower Sector Report. Welcome back to Tower Sector Report. Well, farm sales are on the rise again. In the year to August, more than 1,000 farms changed hands. It's the first time that's happened since 2009, when recession gripped the country and sales almost came to a complete standstill. The Real Estate Institute says the sales trend is up, with the last quarter of the August year showing a 38% increase on the same period last year. But, and it's a big but, the median price paid per hectare during the quarter to August was $15,148 compared to nearly $17,000 last year. Well, to give us a reading on the numbers, the Real Estate Institute's rural market spokesman, Brian Peacock, joins me now. Welcome, Brian.
Thank you, David.
Just how strong is this sales trend?
At the moment, it's steady. I think that what the figures that you've quoted reflect simply the fact that there have been less dairy farms sold in the current quarter than there would normally have been at another time of the year, and that I wouldn't read too much into that change in the average sale price. I think the numbers are the important part of the trend.
I'll come back to that in a minute or two. What I'm asking really is, do you think it's on the up? Are there going to be more sales? Are the prices going to firm?
Volumes are increasing. Prices are staying stable.
Okay. Are there regional variations in this demand?
Yes, there are. What we're seeing at the moment is that there is an increase in the grazing category in particular, and that's occurring in the bottom part of the South Island more than any other part of the country, given that there is a similar demand but less numbers over the balance area of the country.
Is there any particular reason behind that you can discern?
I think it really reflects the fact that there's good, strong confidence being brought about by the product prices, and so grazing properties cater for both sheep and beef farms as well as dairy support type properties, and those are the two categories that are getting the strongest activity currently, and so that's where the demand is coming from.
There's been a lot of conversion to dairy down south too.
There has been, but for all of that, the meat and wool sector is cruising along at a very strong level as well. And those sales are reflected, the sales of farms are reflecting that also.
Okay, what farm types are in particular demand?
There's 7 general categories of properties in the rural sector, and the ones that are being pursued most strongly at the moment would be the 3 being grazing properties, and that would comprise in the last 12 months half the total volume, followed by dairy, and then followed by the finishing type property, which caters for both dairy support and or fattening as well.
What about the little lifestylers?
The lifestyle block market is showing a very strong trend as well.
Goodness,
There's about,
that surprises me.
yeah, well,
Does it surprise you?
It's very steady. It follows the residential market to a large degree. But in the last 12 months, there's been about 4,700 lifestyle blocks sold, and that's showing a pretty healthy trend as well.
Are there normally buying and selling seasons in the year, and if so, what are they?
It tend to be 2 main periods, and they reflect often when the farms are looking their best. So encouragement is generally given to farm owners to market their property in the spring or alternatively in the autumn, and sales figures reflect that. Given that that doesn't necessarily mean that that's when the farms settle. They will traditionally settle in the beginning of June for dairy farms. In other words, that's when possession takes place. Sheep and beef often in the autumn, prior to mating for the ewe flocks and so on.
Yeah, I was going to ask you whether there were fluctuations, whether it tended to drop as the activity peaks in the yearly cycle come through.
Yeah, predominantly the start of the breeding cycle or the production cycle is a normal time for farms changing hands, but given that, it doesn't mean to say that that is the total sum of activity. There is a limited amount of activity in farm sales or farm exchanges occurring throughout the year.
What about this price trend? You know, it looks and it sounds bad when you just use the bald figures, but what's actually happening within there? You made the point that there are some other factors at work.
Sure. If we go back to 2 or 3 years when the global financial crisis struck, we were sitting at record levels for farmland, and what we've seen since then is a backing off to the extent of anywhere from 10 to 15% from the peak on the farms that are really close to cities and towns, to 20% on the medium locations, and 30% plus drop from the peak on the fringe type properties where you've got a more variable contour and improvements and that sort of thing. So the price is levelling off. Well, it slumped, and now it's starting to just increase slightly and levelling at a point where people can see that it's worth buying, that there's economic sense in making the purchases, and that there's sustainable levels of income coming through from the product prices.
Are settlement periods about the same, or are you waiting a little? Are settlement periods about the same, or are you waiting longer or shorter times to see the sales concluded?
It'll reflect a little bit the particular season, and if we look at last season, there was very little activity in the spring, and most of the activity for farm sales came through in the autumn. That reflected very good growing conditions in the autumn and also rising income trends through that period. So we saw through that the second half of the dairy season, Fonterra were gradually advancing their prediction for the payout, and so that was really boosting confidence as it went. The same thing was happening pretty much with the meat and wool sectors as well, particularly the meat, and so that really encourages enthusiasm, or the lack of enthusiasm, which in turn relates to farm sales and farm settlements.
What kind of role are the banks playing in the process? Because there's been changes in terms of their lending criteria, there are changes in interest rates, and there are changes in attitudes. So tell me how the banks are behaving.
The banks always play a big role in farm sales and farm activity generally. There was a major overreaction, the farming sector believes, when the global financial crisis hit us, and there was a lot of retraction that took part in that sector. And from
a lot of pretty highly leveraged properties too, weren't there?
Oh, I guess there were, but maybe the criteria at that stage was a little bit more lenient than what's subsequently been the case. Mm-hmm. So when the banks tightened up, that created a loss of confidence amongst the farming sector, and that overreaction, so it appeared at the time from the banks, has taken a while to overcome. So now as product prices are improving, the banks accept that in some cases they did overact at that time, and are now setting about trying to restore confidence, albeit that there's a cautious degree of confidence coming through. So at the moment there are quite a lot of different seminars being put forward by banks whereby they're encouraging people to reconsider borrowing. They're all saying that they've got money to spend, money to lend. given that criteria is firmer than it was 2 or 3 years ago.
So, all in all, it's a pretty equal field. It sounds like it, in terms of the banks saying we've got more money to lend, but by the way, you're going to have to put a bit more in yourself.
Sure, I think so, but I think the other thing that's worth mentioning is the fact that the Reserve Bank has kept the official cash rate at 2.5%. That in turn is keeping the bank lending rate down. That again encourages borrowing.
Swings and roundabouts. Thanks very much, Brian.
It is gone.
Brian Peacock, Rural Market Spokesman for the Real Estate Institute. And that's all for now. Remember, you can catch our show again anytime via the internet at www.country99tv.co.nz. Thanks for your company. I'm David Beatson for Tower Sector Report. Bye for now.
Sector Report was proudly brought to you by Tower, Rural Insurance Specialists.